And now I will turn it over to Tim and Bishop Marcia. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Marcia and I have agreed in that she did the not it, that I will speak first. And it's wonderful to be with you this morning. Bishop Marcia and I have worked together for a couple years now. I'm on sabbatical right now, but I had served as the chair of the board for Ohio's Interfaith Power and Light, of which Bishop Marcia is the director and doing wonderful work. So we've been able to develop a conversation and a friendship over time that we want to bring to you this morning. And I also want to recognize this is part of an ongoing conversation that OFA has been having for a number of years. We have long-term pioneers like Bill Miller in the room, who has been just a vision of light and hope when it comes to the kind of conversations, what it means to be a farmer in the midst of structural racism and that work, as well as Onika Abraham and Paula Penn Nabrit and Charles Nabrit, Damon Nabrit, other folks have been part of this conversation. So we're grateful to be in this in and of ourselves. And just briefly about myself, I'm a professor at the Methodist Theological School in Ohio. We understand ourselves to both be an ecologically engaged seminary with our farm and with some other things going on. Some of y'all are aware of Seminary Hill Farm, but also an anti-racist institution, with the sense that whatever we do around our expressions of faith, primarily Christian at MTSO, but not totally Christian at MTSO. We have a wonderful Unitarian House of Studies and a number of other conversations happening there, and students from a wide variety of backgrounds, that we are anti-racist in this work. And in that and in my own work, fundamentally know that so much work in ecology has been the work of privileged white people at the expense of persons of color and African-American persons and indigenous people. And the history of that, of folks bearing that burden for the work of white people began at the foundation of this country. Our primary grounding theology in the United States of America is white supremacy. Just want to say that straight up, right out from the very beginning. 1619 is an important date, has been celebrated with us, but it begins even earlier with that, with the removal of indigenous people from their lands, which we recognize, and continues throughout that history. And this is at the heart of what it means to be a nation of farmers, that our ability to move into the land as a group of farmers came at the expense of other people. And this is not to put shame and guilt as the start of this conversation. It's just to say, let's deal with the reality as it is. And from that, from being honest about where our beginnings are, maybe we can begin to think more carefully about where we might be going. So Bishop Marcia and I thought this morning we would talk in kind of two chapters. One is in the first part of this conversation, just to talk about how we've been either engaged in, affected by, witness to the darkness of white supremacy and the racist structures that kind of underlie so much of the work of our country, including farming. And then after a time to take a few questions around that, we'll come back to how do we construct hope together. For those of y'all who are part of Christian traditions, in some ways this might resemble a sermon. Well, you can blame us for that. We both come out of those traditions. So I will just say really briefly, I'm going to take a couple more minutes to talk about my own history. I'm a kid who hated getting his hands dirty, but comes from a long line of farmers from the early 1800s had family in definitely in the U.S. prior to it being the U.S. in the early to mid 1600s in what is now Manhattan, and then on up through the valley of the Hudson Valley, where at least we can trace a couple towns that my family was part of founding. And you can also trace along those lines the massacre of indigenous peoples with my land. I was in a conversation earlier this week with Jim Embry, who some of y'all might know his work really well. Highly recommend his work. And his family and my family came to Kentucky at about the same time in very different ways. Jim, as a long-term fifth-generation African-American farmer in Southern Kentucky, or in parts of Kentucky that my family was also in. We have now promised to have a further conversation about how our families may have had interactions in the past. And I don't expect my family to have come out very well in that, based on the long history we have in Kentucky. So that's part of who I am and part of what the work is. But we know that the history of Ohio goes along those ways, those places too. I did some early research with some colleagues at the Ohio History Center, and there's some early agricultural texts written about Ohio in the early 1900s that talk about in the 1800s that farmers from Kentucky would take raids up into southern Ohio to burn the maize fields of the indigenous people, maize fields that were hundreds of acres, and just kind of a breadbasket for those folks. And we know that we're part of that. And then we go on to now the disinvestment of Black farmers, of Hispanic farmers, of indigenous farmers from the land throughout the history up until today. It's not historical, it's today. And then the big blocks to particularly young farmers, African-American farmers of color, to get land or to farm anywhere, or to have the land that is given to them to be farmable without chemical contaminants and that kind of work. And we know the history of that. And but we also, I want to just say that in knowing that history, how are we going to go forward in different ways? And how we also rewrite the history of farming, even organic farming. A nice little article in Grist magazine a month ago that talks about George Washington Carver as maybe one of the an early organic farmer who we rewrote his history to be the peanut guy. And what that means is he visited all over the South and Midwest, and what that means to do that work, who was talking about the very principles that were put forward through OFA and other organic farming organizations 70, 80, 100 years ago, and what that means. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of where the conversation might go, acknowledge my own participation in the structures of racism, both historically and also working hard to change that contemporary engagement, and also thank OFA for this opportunity. And Bishop Marcia, I wanted to give you an opportunity to not have to just listen to my voice. Please bring yours into this space.
Oh, no, Tim, no problem. Thank you for setting the framework, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first time attending the OFA conference. As Tim stated, we work together. I am the executive director for Ohio Interfaith Power and Light. I am fairly new to this space. I come to the space of farming and these conversations in a real different way, more so from lived experience. I have organized national campaigns over several years, and one of those campaigns was the reauthorization of the Farm Bill. And it was at that time that I learned about the structural, institutional, and political disenfranchisement, especially with Black farmers, and around subsidies, lack of land use, and so on and so forth. But even more personal to me, it became a way that I had a child who was born premature, and I had to give up everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything, because for 5 years he could not be around people because of him contracting what they call respiratory syncytial virus. And I had to get really creative in ways that I would take care of my children. And so that that started me to doing a little bit of gardening or a little bit of urban farming in my own home or on my own land. And so for me, it was really about looking at the different ways that it connected to health, that it connected to caring for my children, that it connected to the socioeconomics of my own life, let alone my community's lives, but also looking at the different ways that I could introduce people, especially Black people and children, into farming or gardening and urban farming. So at that time, I just really started doing a lot of little things to stretch our meals, and that was the way that we were able to basically survive for the 5 years that I had to stay at home and couldn't work and take care of him. So I'm excited to be in this space, but I also look at the fact of how farming has really disenfranchised Black people, Black farmers for so long. And I am hopeful in this space that the quilt that has been covering the soul of this nation in such darkness, that we'll be able to lift that quilt, and we'll understand that we each have a corner to carry or a side to carry as we begin to look at how do we heal the soul of this nation, and how do we build back better, and how do we build upon the unity that we have with one another, or the commonalities more so than our differences. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation, and I'll just let Tim go from here.
I was muted. I just taught a 2-week course with our students, and they said the slogan for the course was going to be, Dr. Van Meter, you're muted. And that would be put on a t-shirt. And it would be accurate. Marcia, I'll answer the question first, but I also want to ask you the same question as to where do you see the structures of racism and our own participation in those structures, particularly myself as a white male, cisgender male, continuing to hold power in our life and in our work. And go for it, and then you can turn the question right back to me if you'd like.
Yeah, well, I won't make you personally responsible for it, Tim. So let's just take some of the pressure off of your shoulders. But it's a historical context. I mean, we have seen the racist impact of this, and we can go far beyond, we can take it back to even the biblical, biblical history, in far as how, people were, it was about the land then and who could have the land, who could till the land. But also if we're moving forward, we began to see it with Black people being slaves. I know we had white people who were indentured servants, and I can't speak to the indigenous community because I'm not indigenous. I can only speak to Blacks. But looking at the farming, or how Black people were brought over from their own continent to till the land, and the soul of, this nation has been built on the backs and the labor of Black people. When we talk about the soul of this nation, we're actually talking about the soul of Black people. We're talking about the blood of Black people who tilled this land, who farmed this land in so many different ways. So it went from slavery, in one form, to then convict leasing, which was just another form of slavery. And even when we think about it in today's time and how it continues to be perpetuated, we can look at just where our prisons are. The prisons are in these rural areas. And what's the rural areas, just really known for? It's known for farming. So we've seen farming take place that way. And then that's where you kind of get that thing, and I've been educated around this, when we talk about rednecks or other people who were in charge, of the jails, simply because they lived out there, they didn't necessarily have the skill set, they didn't have the knowledge, but they did have the land. And so with that being said, we continue to see it perpetuated in so many different ways. Even today, the lack of land use to Black people. And like you said, the toxic land that Black people are offered to farm on, which they really can't farm on. We continue to see it, as I said earlier, in the Farm Bill. Here we are reauthorizing SNAP or food benefits for people, but interestingly enough, to reauthorize these food benefits is under the agricultural bill. So then there comes the farming aspect of it. And then you're dealing with the subsidies, that disproportionately impact Black people. And so farming is just, it shows up in so many different ways. And then it's the nuances that we really don't think about, which brings me to the broader conversation that I always have when we even think about it as far as care, caregiving, child care, health care, all of the disproportionate impacts even there that's connected to farming, because we can't just look at farming as tilling the land and producing food. It's a person's livelihood. And so when you see that, you're still seeing, especially in the rural areas, and I think also getting to a point where we break the narrative that rural just means white, because there are Black people in the rural areas. But even in that, we're still seeing that privilege is still held out there, even though people are still just, suffering from poverty. And so for every 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 Black persons that live in the rural areas, they're still living way beyond the poverty lines, even though there are white people who are living in poverty. So here we still see where they don't have an opportunity to sell the way that, white farmers want to sell. White farmers are still trying to, they feel intimidated, when other people come into the space, even if it's just smaller spaces. And even though we don't look at it as a very overt form, it's just so many other ways that we see racism spewing up inside of this. And so, and if we just keep it in the form of white supremacy, it's just perpetuated through capitalism. And when you think about that, then you get into the structural, the institutional, and all of these other isms that has divided us for so long, that continues to splice the opportunity for division to confront racism. Because as I said to you earlier, how do we have the conversations that begin to break these divides when, if only Black people are talking to other Black people about racism, and white people are only talking to white people about white supremacy? How do we begin to break these forms of structural and institutional and political and economic disenfranchisement and injustices? And so I see those are some of the ways. It's not all of the ways, but I think those are some of the ways that we continue to see it perpetuated. And so I'm going to turn it back over to you and ask you the same thing. How do you, Tim, I think from, and I can appreciate this about you in our relationship, because you're going to be so honest with me and say, a white woman couldn't handle this the way that you're handling it, Marcia. So I know you're going to tell the truth. But I do have to ask, being one who's in this space often, educating in this space, living in this space, making this space part of your sabbatical, what are some of the more deeper rooted ways that institutional and structural racism shows up, inside of farming?
Yeah, and inside of all of our institutions. I've said this to colleagues, and I said it enough that it's no longer confidential, but if you want to find out the racism of your colleagues in any institution, have an African-American woman lead, and white people will show their ass again and again and again. And we have an African-American dean, Valerie Bridgman, at MTSO, and the nonsense she puts up with from educated people at times embarrasses the hell out of me. And we have conversations. And I have told her, if I ever act that way, you can shoot me and I'll testify at your trial that I had it coming. That basically is a kind of nonsense that comes out of us. And it comes out not just because you want to be, not because it's just we've been grounded and formed in racism. Sometimes as white men and white women, it comes out because we want to be right about racism. We want to be the aware person in the room. And so therefore, we all know, oh gosh, I just realized what I'm entering into. I'm going to both mansplain and whitesplain at the same time, which is just really embarrassing. But we know what both those things are, and let's just say those terms exist because they're real, and we can go forward from there. The other thing I'm thinking about is like Marcia, in conversations with our colleague Reverend Dr. Heber Brown III. Talks about the Black Church Food Security Network, and that coming about because of the health of his people in his congregation. And Marcia, you've said a lot about this too. It's just the way our food system is structured to feed hungry people perpetuates and increases the very diseases that people are dying from in these communities. And this is a place where folks who farm like you all farm in this conversation can make a tremendous and radical difference in that. But the market is structured in such a way that it keeps everybody apart from making these decisions together, from offering people who need it as much or more than anyone the healthiest and best possible food. And I think about something else. This is in a conversation with Reverend Brown again, Pastor Brown, walking around markets. And until he told me this, I didn't really notice. And now I try to notice this, walking around markets and watching people walk by the Black farmers with their stand to buy the same produce 2 tables down from white farmers. And this is part of the contemporary racism too, completely unaware of, very often in some of the markets we have in Columbus, and we know where many of them are, folks who understand themselves to be at the height of wokeness, just very aware, but their dollars don't follow their attitudes. And so to be a farmer in these contexts and not even being allowed to begin to form the relationships with customers, which are so important to almost every market or organic farmer, because people walk by you, is also both a symptom and a result of racism. And I think about, how do we bridge that? How do you go to a market and sometimes intentionally send folks to other farms just because you know they'll be walking by them? It's just one thought. But the structures that we exist in, and we've talked about the land disinvestment, which continues, of generational farmers being removed from the land, whether it's through bad state law like quitclaim deeds in the South or other forms of that, or just other ways that you make it economically impossible for folks to hold on the land. So then people, like the report that came out a week ago, so then the largest landowner in the US is now Bill Gates. And those two things go together. The disinvestment of small farmers, particularly African-American and other farmers of color, and the ability for a few families to hold all the land. And this is the other thing that I think is a real place of possible solidarity over and against not just racism, but what it means to have healthy food, is to try to continue to structure ways for food sovereignty to be held as the core value, and not just healthy food for all, but healthy food for all for communities that have the right to their own growing, to their own ability to do that.
So Tim, can I interrupt?
One of the things
can I interrupt?
Please,
because
please.
You bring something to the point that we don't talk about often. And what you're really saying, and what I hear you saying, is that food is a human right, and we're treating food like it's privileged. We're treating access to food as though it's privileged. I would call that necropolitics. You know, we have to break down the necropolitics of all of this, because when we're talking about food, you're also talking about the life of people. And so in that space of necropolitics is really saying who gets to live and who gets to die. And you know, you mentioned taking over. We can't forget eminent domain either, you know, because of all of these different political tensions or policies that have been set up in the framework of the Constitution continues to belie all of these social ills that we're experiencing today. But when we can start talking about food as a human right, just like healthcare is a human right, and start attaching or threading all of those things together, then we get to advance the conversation in a much richer and deeper way. Because food is a human right, healthcare or health is a human right, the ability to be able to live. Because what people don't understand, and I'm going to put a pin in it after this, and this is just food for thought that I've even had to have myself. People who are in the space, especially Black people, they're not, as many times as people want to think that Black people and poor people want a hand up and a hand out, they really don't. What they want to do is to be able to have the right to be able to live, to eat, to go to doctors, to have childcare, to be able to go to the grocery market and get, like you said, good produce, to not have to live in food barren areas or under food apartheid and have to go to the Dollar Tree, you know, to shop for their food, or to go to the farmer's market and they're getting the leftovers because we've gone to the bigger farmer markets. And so really, when we can reframe this conversation from a point of isms to rights, then I think we can then flip this coin over and start advancing a conversation that makes people curious about others, where we can get curious about one another, because I feel like there's a lot that we can learn from one another when it comes to farming and urban farming. I used to live in, work with people in Youngstown, Ohio. And Youngstown, if any of you know, is really a food desert, and so is Warren, but they have master gardeners out here. What would it look like to be able to bring all of those master gardeners together and give them some good land, and then be able to farm that land and to, you know, grow produce, and then take that and start building our own community markets, you know, because why? Economics really is a human right. And going back to just one point, when you talked about racism, it reminds me of the Moynihan reports, who said that Black people would come to the knowledge that they are deserving of what white people have. And so politics for a very long time has been telling the same story over and over again, which is something we don't do very well. We shift our story, we change our story, but they've been driving the same narrative for years, because the ultimate goal is what? To not give people access.
I think to bring this into Sunday morning, Bishop, I agree with you 100%. And, you know, the eminent domain arising out of manifest destiny, connected with the doctrine of discovery, and all of these kind of principles come out of this colonial theology of go and take, it's ours, resources are scarce. And I think what's at the foundation of how I understand my own theological grounding, but I also think this is very much in line with what it means to be a farmer, an organic farmer, is that we live in a world of abundance. And so when African-American folks and other people of color begin to say, I deserve what white people have, the response from white people doesn't need to be, oh, what am I going to lose? It should be, how do I live in partnership and in relationship with folks in order to make sure they have, because we live in a world of abundance. And when folks are taking care of their land in such a way where the soil has more life and the fertility grows generation upon generation and crop upon crop, that soil becomes a place of abundance. When we extract and strip mine and take everything out of the land and of the soil, it becomes a place of scarcity. And we've had this conversation before, Bishop, but about, you know, just at the very basic level, the framing of Mother Earth, or the framing of women's bodies, and how we understand our relationship to the earth, and how we abuse women, particularly women of color, within our culture. It's not coincidence. It is the same grounding philosophies in that. So how do you live out of a place of abundance, of relationship, of love, of caring, in such a way to where every human being has the rights that you're calling for? And I think that's not just Christian theology, that's Hebrew. It's found in Islam. It is found in Buddhism and in Hinduism. It is found that this sense of with all is at the heart of what it means to be the best form of human being. I see that my internet connection is unstable, so I hope that all came through. But Bishop, please, what are your thoughts in that?
So one thing, as you were talking, a few things came through my mind, but I'd like to, if we could, just address Noreen Warnock's question that says, might you address what your faith-based places are specifically doing right now to help keep working on anti-racism? Noreen, I think that's a very broad question, because that also has to be brought in internally, because Black churches are really not the ones who need to be anti-racist. It's the ones who need not to be suffering from the racism. And so it goes into a point is, how do we bring together the other faiths who believe in this, who are dealing with these racist underpinnings or racist undertones. And so I really can't, I know from just places that I've been in, you've had people kind of educating themselves, coming into circles and having book clubs and really talking about it across the pulpit. But again, I just stand firm on, if you're going to learn how to be an anti-racist, then you have to ask people, what is it going to take, you know, for me not to appear this way? And this isn't anything that happens instantly, because white America has never had to have this conversation. White America really has never had to look at racism in the way that Black and Indigenous and people of color and others who have had to look at it this way. They've had it land on their body in so many different ways. And white America has not had to deal with that. And so the real question, I think, is not only about what are the people of faith doing, but what are people who share the same belief that all people should have access. When we can just take it from out of the faith-based space and put it into a belief space, because not everybody has a denomination. Not everybody feels as though they're in the quote unquote church space, but everybody does have a belief. And I believe when we can call people out on their beliefs, then we can start breaking down some of these systemic issues inside of racism and other isms, because the question would be asked, do you believe Black farmers should be able to farm on good land, and should they have land? And if the answer is yes, let's work together on, you know, dismantling some of this rhetoric, some of this behavior and all of those things, so that we can come together in a unified way. But this is an individual work as well as a collective work. But I think more importantly, it's going to be a truthful and transparent work in a struggle that many people will not want to struggle with or grapple with, because it says something to us about us. But those of us who don't mind struggling in the shame and in the soil and the toxic ooze, knowing that we can't come up out of the miry clay, then we will wrestle and grapple together, and we will get curious about one another, and we will identify the solutions to this bit by bit by bit. And I think that's where we start at. It's individual and it's collective. I hope I answered the question, because I can't speak for everybody, but I do know that in order for us to do something, it has to start with someone. Another thing that you talked about, Tim, and it just brought joy to me as I listened to this, and this is not so much as the soil, but it takes me back to a faith story, the story about the 2 fish and the 3 loaves. And when you say that we have more than enough, we do have more than enough. We just have to start realizing that in that more than enough, that we don't have to clutch our pearls with it and say, mine, mine, mine. You know, you had people who were hungry. You had we had 5,000 people, at least men, to sit down. And the disciples said to Jesus, oh, send them away. You know, they've got to go eat. And Jesus says, nope, what do we have? What do we have? You got 2 fish and 3 loaves or 5 loaves. But the bottom line is that Jesus saw what he had as enough. And then even inside of having enough, there was still some left over for others. I say that to say, when we can realize that what we have is enough, and our overflow is not for us to stash away, but our overflow is for it to flow into others. Because when you have enough and you have that overflow, then you can give to somebody else and they can have enough. And then we have fragments to give up. But it's until we change, as you said, the way that we think and the way that we see things. So you just got me excited. I went to church for a moment with my own self with that statement. But like you said, the Buddhist and Confucianism and all of that. And this is why even in my own faith, I remember growing up and they used to say such negative things. And I was like, I didn't understand it because I was young. But when I learned that it's not about religion, it's about a way of life, I was really able to appreciate Buddhism and Confucianism and all others, because what they have is an appreciation for life and for others. And that's something that, a moniker, I guess, that we need to have on our own hearts, that I have an appreciation for life and the life of others. Then we can kind of move, into some things. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we've made the pivot to the good, how do we build something together? And that's a couple of the questions there. And I thank you. We need to make that pivot, because it's part of what I'm trying to do with the conversations is that we build towards construction. I mean, I still have to have questions. I teach incoming students at the seminary. We talk about what it means to be anti-racist, what it means to be open and affirming and welcoming to LGBTQ folks, what it means to be all the ways we say we are as an institution, and what kind of discomfort that creates. But then also we have to be aware that we have to build something. So a couple of the questions, I do want to say OFA is doing some stuff. We're in some conversations with OFA. Renee and I have been in some ongoing conversations early on with folks at Ohio State, and I know that Casey and Buckeye ISA and INFACT has some things going on that others have been part of. Angela and Dana as early on in that work. That Rachel's been part of a conversation about increasing the availability to African American farmers and farmers of color. We want to continue in that. My hope for MTSO is that we become this kind of catalyzing institution, this hub. That, you know, there's levels of real important knowledge happening at Ohio State and Central State and other universities in the state that can ground the agricultural knowledge and ecological knowledge in really important ways. But sometimes they don't have the room to speak of justice in a way that a seminary can and that a church can. And we want to be that space. For the past 18 months, I've been meeting with a group of pastors in Canton about once a month, Canton, Ohio. And we started as a Bible study, which my colleagues will tell you I'm the last person they want reading the Bible, because basically I think it's a revolutionary document, and it is to ground radical action, that it's not some kind of palliative to comfortable people. But we've been reading that together, and to begin with food insecurity and food apartheid and those kind of actions and moving. And in the 18 months, there's been some real happening there. First, about what it means to ask community opinion and ask to themselves to now go out and break. But what does it also mean to provide? How much of that came through, Milo? Is it okay?
Not too much, Tim. Maybe you could try, I hate to do this, but you might try turning off your video. That might help. Yep.
Most people prefer not having to look at my face, so this is good. So basically what I'm saying is that I've been working with pastors, some in Canton, Youngstown and Canton, in recent reports have come across as the second and the third most impoverished cities in the country. There's a city in Mississippi that leads around childhood poverty, around lack of education. So to have the action happening up there, the group of pastors been working with for 18 months are now constructing a fresh market space. They'll work with Stark Fresh, but they're also starting that kind of work. They're now beginning a housing space that's going to have gardening and farming gardening as part of that. They're now beginning other ways to address poverty, just based on forming a coalition together that begins to expand and expand. Some of y'all may have some familiarity with the United Methodists. One of my critiques of the United Methodists, of which I am a part, is they think they can do things by themselves. And it is the wrong way to approach any problem. So a significant amount of my work is just convincing some United Methodist churches partner with people in your community who might be doing the good work. But yes.
I was just going to say, and we have to, even from our churches, have to remember that when we approach these issues, we cannot approach them with the savior mentality, but in a form of relationship one to another. Because a lot of times if we're going to talk about how do we, I won't say build the intention, I would say how do we set the intention? And when we can set the intention to be more relational than transactional, which a lot of people just, and I mean that by saying people come in and go out and they tell you, and that doesn't help to be the repairer of the breach, or to build the bridge or be the bridge. So I just say that, you know, for our faith folks, because a lot of times we get out there and we have our food day, our food pantry day, we have our toiletry day. But the question is, and a lot of times churches will think that's what I'm supposed to do. And I don't, and that's enough. And to be honest with you, it's not enough. We have to do more. And I want to agitate people on their belief, whatever, you know, if you believe that people should be able to have access, they should be healthy, their children should be healthy, that they should have the same rights as other people, then we have to, I believe, have some real conversations about where this began. Wrestle with that, set the intention to continue down this pathway, because in reality, what we keep doing is just leaving rotten inheritances for our children and our children's children. And rather than leaving love and legacy and leadership, we're leaving toxicity. And so I see in the chat, and I just bring this up because I see in the chat, there are a lot of people who are asking around conversations around racism. I see where Kathy has shared some things. But the truth of the matter is, set that intention. We have to set that intention. And churches, and I'm going to say this, and I don't mean any, no pun intended, I am always going to be truthful and transparent because that's what I'm called to do. Some of the churches have to go back and check their resolutions and their beliefs, because one of the reasons we have three flavors of the Methodist is because of some of the racial tensions inside of that. We have to get real. Some churches have these resolutions and their foundations have been built on these things. And so if we are going to dismantle, de-seat, interrupt, and then come back and reimagine, we have to start sometimes in our own backyards and in our own hearts. But when we can truthfully talk about these things and hold space with one another and learn how to step up, step back, step with, and step aside, we can do some things. And we should make the conversation all about me just learning racism, but learning how to dismantle that racism, learning how to not marginalize people in this space, and learning how to ask the question of need. What do we need to work together? Because I'll be honest, Black people have gotten to a point, Indigenous people, people of color have gotten to a point where they feel like I'm tired of having to explain myself or be digestible. And the truth is, in all fairness, the conversation just has not had to be had. And so in all fairness, people who don't know, they don't know. You just don't know. But if we set the intention, you know, and just kind of like wave the white glove or whatever it's going to take, then we can begin to have it. And it's not, and let me say this, and I'm done. Don't have them siloed. We never can do anything. We don't achieve anything in silos. If you only have 10 white people talking to 10 white people, where are we getting? Because you're only just shifting your own values one to another. It's when you make the space a little more flavorful and a little more, you know, I don't really care for Brussels sprouts anymore. I tried over and over again, but for those things that we don't care about, even if we set the intention to at least try again, I think we're making some good first steps. Do we need to take questions? It's 11:48. I know I talked and talked.
You talked just enough.
Do we want to open it up for questions?
Let's, yes.
Yeah, I see thank you very much for kind of keeping an eye on that chat box and answering some as they've come along. And there's great discussions happening over there a little bit. I think it'd be interesting if you could speak to you know, I think a few folks are looking for places to hook in and or maybe important like readings or you know, kind of foundational level experiences that you might suggest for folks who are looking to do anti-racist work in themselves and community. Could you speak to that?
Bishop, I see you're staying muted. Does that mean I go first?
Please, because I was actually reading
Okay.
a question around the societal context of equity.
Yeah, and Casey, there's several really wonderful comments in there. I agree with Casey. Some of the work of Buckeye ISA, in fact, Rachel, the work you're beginning, I don't know if we were ready to publish this yet or not, but the Steiner work that you've agreed to do around stories could be an important thing. I also think that many farmers who are doing the type of farming that OFA represents has stories of long attention to a place in such a way where it heals it. And I think if you think about that and turn it from land to relationship, there's a place there for long-term engaged relationship in such a way where we can become people of healing rather than just these kind of, I'm making motions with my hands, which make no sense right now with my muted, but to try to build a life together around that. But, you know, the work of even Kendi, for those of y'all who are in the white Christian church, Robert Jones' book, White Too Long, is a book I would recommend. For those of y'all who have interest in law, The Color of Law is another book I would recommend. I think one of Kendi's books is How to Be an Anti-Racist, also stamped from the beginning. I mean, it's the same ones that come up again and again. I'm not against the book White Fragility, but I think it kind of gives an out to folks who don't really need an out. So read that with a sense that don't enter in. I'm going to say something about that. In that, white fragility is not one more way to claim a space for white people, and having it named is not a help. Is only helpful if you now say, I have behaved badly for a very long time, but it's not helpful in any other way. The other thing for folks who are trying to work on this from the perspective of a white person, realize that shame, that guilt, that frustration are ways to opt out of really important conversations you need to opt into. And so don't allow those to be the governing level of how you're going to engage this. Recognize it. I'm ashamed. I'm embarrassed. I just said something incredibly stupid to a person I want to have a relationship with, and apologize and do your best to heal and go forward. The defensiveness that so many white folks feel is a block to any kind of way of going forward. And so if you have to stay in the behind the wall, to go to Nehemiah, to go to the behind the wall conversation to where you work on your defensiveness, you work on your inability to be fully open and vulnerable with a person of color, have that conversation. But then please put yourself at risk. Get out there and put yourself at risk, not where others have to be your educators, but where you are willing to be in a relationship that allows you to see truthfully all the ways you're broken and need to be a part of the healing rather than part of that.
Yeah.
Milo or Rachel, I think we could probably put together yes, there's some book lists up there. The other thing I want to say is, I'll say it later. I want Bishop Marcia to talk right now.
The only thing I would add to that, Tim, is a couple things we have to understand. Part of this is a language barrier. You know, language is important. How you hear one thing and how another person hears one thing is very critical. So that's another one of the barriers that we have to break down. And I say that because in those conversations, people will say, I'm not a racist, I have a Black friend. that's really disingenuous, and it doesn't make anybody feel any better because you have a Black friend. Because even so, you may say, but honestly, you know, if you really got really mad at that Black friend, what would, you know, then what would the thoughts kind of be? White Fragility, I agree with you. I'm not big on that book, but I also have to look at white fragility has been a form of violence on the bodies of others, because what it does is it shifts and says, I'm the victim. And we're not trying to look at victimhood. You know, what we're really trying to say is how do we have a conversation that goes across the lines? How do we go to a conversation that addresses the social, economic, racial, gender, and the long list of inequities that I continue to see come through in the chat box, and understanding that it's not a pocket conversation. And I say this to people all the time. We are not in 50 different fights with one round. We are in one fight with 50 different rounds. And so when we realize there is so much more that encompasses this ecosystem of what we're trying to either cut out, tear down, or even, you know, and reconnect in some really healthy ways, then we have to understand that the conversation is going to be different for other people because of what has landed on their bodies with regards to their lived experience. And remembering this, you don't have to validate my lived experience, and I don't have to validate yours. What we can come to is a consensus of respect. And when we can come to that consensus of respect, then we can move into relationship. You mentioned stories, and we have to be careful with that, because you can't just go into one person and say, hey, you're a farmer, let me hear your story. They don't care because you're not in relationship. But when we can just sit down, and I mean, and when we think about it historically, even now, what is the best way to have that conversation? We invite people to a good meal. We sit in the backyard around the fire. We, you know, as mothers, we go to our kids' games and we breathe together, because now we don't have to take on all of these other woes. But it is such simple ways that we come together and we have these conversations. And believe it or not, all your stories and everything you need to know, you'll learn. And never be afraid to say, you know what, I don't mean any harm. I don't understand. Because I'll be honest with you, I will say the same thing to you. I've had a hard time in my life being a woman who has dealt with not only racism, but colorism, and not knowing what side of the fence that I stand on, because I've been spat on by Black people. And I have, because I'm a light-skinned Black woman, and been called the N-word by them. And I've had the same thing go on in you know, with white people. And I say that, and some Black people may throw rocks at me, but I also know that even inside of our own race, we have a set of isms that we have to deal with too. And when we can all, again, and I can't stress it enough, when we can all come to a point of hearing one another and acknowledging those things, we can begin to heal. We can heal the land. We can heal the hearts. We can heal the community, because all of these things come back and they live in our community, and they just create toxic systems or continue to perpetuate unjust systems. And stories, like I said, you didn't ask me for my story. I shared it with you, because that's what a conversation is all about. It's about the commonalities. And if we can build upon that which we have in common, more so than the things that we don't, then people will begin to learn that, oh, white supremacy kind of did hit a white woman, or hit this person. And it may have hit you differently, because, and I'm gonna wrap my mouth up, is that I used to think about, how did a white woman feel who's about her husband who claimed he didn't like Black women, and Black women were called dogs and all kind of things, and you were just like the ugh of the land, but you had no problem sleeping with her. And then you would come home and you would sleep with your wife too. I often wondered how that form of patriarchy felt to that white woman, you know, and those are just like little bridges and nuggets of conversations that we can have.
Thank you. Thank you. I feel like we need to pause in some ways. I also feel like we have limited time. Stephen had written something that I wanted to build on, not respond to. That we are in the, this is more me than his comment, this is just what sparked in me, but we are in a time where we're seeing either the death throes or the resurgence of white supremacy at the root of our very government. And I don't know that we should see anybody in power as a true ally for justice. There may be some there, but I'm not sure the Democrats are any more concerned about, some are, there's some wonderful folks within that. So I muted my screen, I saw if people were freezing. So the thing I want to say is it's important for those of us in this struggle to know that that your struggle is my struggle. That your struggle, like you don't go to a Black Lives Matter march so that you can make sure that land rights are also spoken of there. You go to a Black Lives Matter march to march with folks for Black Lives Matter. And then you bring up how in conversation, how different elements of the overall struggle are important for all of us. Part of how the structures of white supremacy remain in power is to make sure that none of us live in cooperative relationship. And the collectivism of unions, hi Bill, the collectivism of other elements of how we can live together is a way for the freedom of folks who are left out of power. And the only way we're going to stand in resistance to this resurgence and make sure it is the dying of the structures of white supremacy is together. And so we have to figure out how to build these bridges together and stand in solidarity together over and against what is a grotesqueness that is at least getting far more conversation than it has in the previous few years. And we need to stand over and against that.
I just say, I echo that. I have nothing else to say. I echo your liberation is tied to my liberation. So beautifully said. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both so much. And for the rich conversation that's happening in the chat, for folks staying engaged with this, it's the good, hard work, good trouble, right? So again, I appreciate you being here. Or maybe Milo, could you post the evaluation in the chat? This is our overall conference evaluation. And as we're starting to come towards the conclusion of our event, we do encourage you to take time to give us feedback and share the things that you want to see OFA doing more of, which may include conversations like this. Because we do very much take that to heart so that we can continue to grow and learn from each other in the future. Tim and Bishop Marcia, thank you so much for starting our day this way. And I just welcome everyone to stay curious and stay bound up in this work together.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel. And I'm going to offer a brief commercial. My research is on how farmers are making meaning in their own work and practice. And that's what I'm on sabbatical to be doing. So if you have interest in those conversations, please reach out to me. I see a number of people in this conversation I'm going to reach out to. But that's really what my research is for the next couple of years, but really the 6-month sabbatical. And I would love to have as many conversations as I can with folks within this space about how do you think about meaning and your work in relationship to the world. So email me.
Great, and you can find that email in the Socio app. Again, you'll find the evaluation link there and the schedule in for the rest of our time together. So again, thanks so much for being here, and we will see you at other events on the internet in the hours to come. Take care, everyone.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you
Thank you.
so much.
Amen.
Thank you.